So moving on, next we've got Matt Franklin's Senior Research Fellow at the School of Health and Related Research at the University of Sheffield, and Matt's going to talk to us about economic evaluations to inform local commissioning decisions. So over to you, Matt.
I'm hoping this has worked. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Yep, excellent. Well, thank you for having me today. And now I'm going to be talking about economic evaluations to inform local commissioning decisions, challenges and opportunities. I was going to give a blurb about me, but I'll ignore that for the sake of time. So let's get straight into it. So why is local commissioning important to aid in research? Well, the fact of the matter is actually a large proportion of care commissioning budgets are at local levels, not national levels, with the main exception being drugs. So in reality, what we've got is these organisations like clinical commissioning groups, which are going to move into the integrated care systems. And these are NHS commissioners, which commission the majority of NHS services. Now, they did hold around about 2/3 of the NHS budget. So they're a big play in terms of commissioning services. But also there's commissioners of kind of non-NHS services. So local authorities like city councils, publicly fund social care and some public health services. Now, an ageing population requires cost-effective care across these sectors and regions. And so the evidence that we develop needs to appeal to these local commissioners. When moving research into practice, that means that we need to produce appropriate evidence to inform their commissioning processes. But if evidence is not geared to local context and evidence needs, it's quite possible then that services or interventions which we suggest are cost effective aren't actually commissioned. And this can be due to disconnects in producing inappropriate evidence or even misunderstanding evidence. And this can act as a wall. So we can be ended up talking two languages, and we could be producing evidence that actually can't make it into practice. So we've already talked about the kind of standard conventional economic evaluation. The most common one is obviously what NIHR recommends, which is associated with health technology appraisal processes. There's this kind of cost per quality framework. We base the quality adjustment on the EQ5D. We produce incremental cost effectiveness ratios. There's other things like cost effectiveness planes and CACs. And we tend to compare this to a cost of excess threshold. Now, these methods aren't wrong per se. They have been developed over decades, and we're still developing them with huge focus. But there is an issue that local commissioners don't actually base their commissioning decisions on the aforementioned evidence. So there's a real disconnect between research evidence and actual practical use of this evidence for commissioning. And there's kind of 7 perceived elements of disconnect. Now, there's a fair few papers out there which are worth reading where people that develop economic evaluations, like health economists, have actually talked to local decision makers about their evidence needs and the economic evaluation framework. A lot of what I talk about today comes from an ARC funded project done by people in York like Seb, Laura and Jerry, all of whom are talking today. But there's also some other work done by other people like Emma Frew over in Birmingham. And the 2 papers I've particularly reflected at look not only at the CCG NHS perspective, but also what's needed for local authorities. So this kind of cross-sector perspective. And if you look over these papers, there's a fair few things which are common and commonly come up across sectors. But there's basically 7 elements of disconnect, which I'm going to get into today, where the conventional economic evaluation differs from actual local decision maker reality. And this includes the use of cost-effective threshold, implications of decision uncertainty and budgetary excess, the valuation of future costs and outcomes, and then the scope of included costs or included outcomes, and then the transparent reporting of costs and effects for different sectors and subgroups. Now, these are rabbit holes, as I said before. So what I want to do is give an overview of these 7 challenges, but basically lean into this idea that there's opportunities, and actually health economists already have a lot of tools at our disposal to try and deal with these elements of disconnect. So let's get into it in terms of the cost effectiveness threshold. The cost effectiveness threshold has been introduced, and it's really useful for a binary decision. So the idea that something is cost effective or not. So for example, if we're paying £40,000 for something and we get 2 QALYs and our cost effective threshold is £20,000 per QALY, this is cost effective at this point. And we can kind of move across this line. So if we're paying 20,000 for one quality, this is considered cost effective. If we're paying 60,000 for 3 qualities, it's still cost effective if we're willing to pay £20,000 per quality. If we end up with an intervention actually that can produce 2 qualities for £20,000, this is below the line, so obviously it is cost effective. But if we end up producing 2 qualities at £60,000, this is above the line, and their spell wouldn't be cost effective. So it's really useful to try and guide these ideas around cost effectiveness or not. And it's important to realize that actually there are implications of having too high a cost effectiveness threshold. So if we're willing to allocate too much because we put a larger value on per quality gained, this can lead to opportunity costs, because if we put that value, extra value on the qualities, wherever we spend that money can't be spent on anything elsewhere. So we said, right, we're going to pay £30,000 per quality, and we start investing in stuff that's £30,000 per quality. It might mean that actually new future interventions, which are £10,000 per quality, we can't actually fund in the future. And I'll get into this idea of disinvestment and displacement under my second challenge. But the other thing is that using a national cost effectiveness threshold can be misleading and isn't currently linked to a very important concept of affordability. So there is this idea of a paradox that you can have something that's cost effective, but it's unaffordable. So for example, if we said that, right, this intervention here is, it costs 40,000 and we get 2 qualities, this is cost effective. But actually, when we put this to a population of 100,000, so 100,000 times 40,000, actually this becomes unaffordable. So it goes completely outside our potential budget. So we need to account for affordabilities. And the fact of the matter is, cost effectiveness thresholds are likely to vary at local levels when we start thinking about linking outcomes to actual care spending and the displacement that causes. So kind of supply side cost effectiveness threshold, which is related to that Claxton threshold, which Seb presented earlier. Challenge 2, in terms of exceeding budgets. At the national level, there is some flexibility with moving between budgets and even moving budgets over time. At the local level, however, this is quite different. There's very little flexibility. There are implications if you overspend. And this idea of a new care technology, if you bring something new in, the budget tends to already be spoken for. So if you bring something in new, you need to get rid of something else. And this requires disinvestment. And disinvestment is a complex concept, particularly for commissioners to tackle with. Because people like it when you bring in new stuff, they don't really like it when you start taking away stuff. So affordability is a major concern here, but budgets are very complex. But there are ways that you can start to think about how can we take into account budgets within existing frameworks. So for example, you could start to think about, alongside your conventional economic evaluation, should I do a budget impact analysis? So you can see on the right here, I've given a very brief overview of what budget impact analysis might be when you start to look at the population, target population resources and cost of illness of what the current environment is, compare this to the new environments, and any difference would be the budget impact. There's also a method which isn't really used that much anymore, but if you talk to local decision makers, they're familiar with it, program budgeting and marginal analysis. It is a method which focuses specifically on budgets, but it's actually difficult to utilize, and it's at times it's difficult to actually identify the budget which is going to be spent. But there's new work around how can we actually account for affordability within the cost effectiveness threshold. This is quite complex, but it is an area which is being focused on at the moment. So when we're using the cost effectiveness threshold, is there a way to better account for affordability within that? In terms of challenge 3, the valuation of future costs and benefits, essentially NICE suggests that we should have a lifetime perspective with costs and outcomes discounted at 3.5% per year. So we start to value outcomes and costs in the future less and less. But this discount rate can depend on several factors which differ at the local level relative to the national level. And this includes opportunity costs of expenditure today, time preference, risk adversity, consumption growth, tradability of money and health. All this differs at a local relative to the national level. However, the actual direction and change in discount rate is difficult to suggest because the availability of investment options may reduce the rate, whereas the short-term nature of budget cycles may actually increase the rate. So although we're saying 3.5% might not be appropriate to the local level, the exact way it should move, we're not 100% sure, but it could be explored. Another challenge is distinctly the scope of costs. So as already mentioned before, NICE kind of suggests that we should focus on NHS and PSSS costs, and these are considered relevant. Unfortunately, this means that costs fall on public health budgets, patients or the carers, like non-out-of-pocket payments, aren't included in these approaches. At a local level, this approach kind of works to a certain degree for CCGs and ICSs who are focused on the NHS and the healthcare sector. It doesn't really work for other sectors, and this can be a problem if you're trying to deal with cross-sectoral economic evaluations. It's also possible for upfront costs to fall on one budget sector. So the LAs could invest in some kind of community-based service, some kind of social care service, and this will reduce admissions to hospital, but then the benefits are seen in trusts and on the NHS. Although the current healthcare bill promotes joint working between LAs and CCGs and kind of using joint budgets, it's still a bit of a concern and how to negotiate this kind of sharing of budgets and responsibilities, but also the benefits and savings later on. And I get into this more to do with Challenge 6. But also if we're going to include the whole range of costs across sectors, so NHS costs, social care costs, costs on care homes, education, transport, so on and so forth, you kind of need to know what resource use is happening there so you can apply unit costs to it. Unfortunately, non-healthcare routine data, in terms of routine data in this area, has complexities. For example, there's limited metadata. Metadata is data about data. So if I want to know what data is being collected to do with social care, actually, I can't go online and find that like you can with the NHS with data dictionaries. It's a lot more complicated to understand. And Chris will actually be discussing routine data considerations, at least for economic analysis, later on. And then a common thing that comes out is also the scope of outcomes. As we've already said before, the kind of recommended measure is the EQ5D, and the EQ5D works on the QA bit in the quality estimation. It's important to note that NICE is interested in impact on carer health related to quality of life. But there's a whole range of outcomes and even outcome measures which could be used. There's a wide variety of health-related and non-health measures. So you can start to focus on aspects like capability, well-being, subjective life satisfaction, and so on and so forth. We see a broad range of outcomes being interest, at least in terms of monitoring services. So with social care, we have the adult social care outcomes framework. But these outcomes tend to be used for monitoring, not for commissioning care services. That is, it's not directly linked to achieving to payment systems. So if you achieve an outcome, that's good for monitoring. But in terms of commissioning a service on that basis, there is no linkage there. And outcomes-based commissioning relative to commissioning on the basis of purchasing services in units consumed isn't really the norm. And in terms of this kind of scope of outcomes, Clara will discuss considerations related to measuring wider benefit later on. In terms of Challenge 6, costs and effects for different sectors, we commonly, in economic evaluation, report an ISA. And an ISA looks at incremental crossover, incremental outcomes, but everything's kind of bundled together. So when you show an ISA, a single figure is useful to determine cost effective. It doesn't really tell you where these costs and effects are really falling. And obviously we often focus on a single outcome, which is the quality. And within these costs and effects, there tends to be limited non-health and non-healthcare aspects included, as I've described under challenges 4 and 5. But there are existing frameworks to try and deal with this. So for example, cost consequence analysis is a method, basically, it's an economic evaluation method, but it's based on disaggregation. So you disaggregate the costs, you disaggregate the effects, and you show all of them in a disaggregated fashion to your decision maker. The problem there is that decision makers can pick and choose which outcomes and costs they focus on, so that can be a bit of a problem because they don't always carry equal weight in terms of what you prefer to prioritize. An alternative method is multi-criteria decision analysis. The key thing about MCDA is that it involves stakeholder engagement and deliberation to actually inform weighting and trading off different outcomes, but also criterion. So what do you actually want to achieve? What's your maximum, for example? And there's been even newer methods to start thinking about, all right, how do we show the costs and effects in different sectors, like in health, other forms of consumption, on the criminal justice system. And this has been called an extended impact inventories framework. It kind of works like a cross-sector CCA, where you're kind of looking at disaggregation, but you're focusing more on the different sectors where outcomes and costs will fall. In terms of challenge 7, cost and effect for different subgroups, this really stems into this idea that within health economics, economic evaluation, general policy making and commissioning, we're really trying to understand and tackle inequalities, particularly health inequalities at the moment. And we can actually end up with this kind of equity, efficiency, impact plane like what I show on the right, where it is possible to have a cost-effective outcome which can improve equity, but it's just as possible to have a cost-effective outcome which actually harms equity. On the other hand, we could end up with a situation where we can improve equity, but it's cost ineffective. So we can end up within these different situations, but there have been methods which have been designed to try and deal with this. And there's generally 2 approaches: impact and weighting. Impact is the more simple. It's basically you produce the cost effectiveness analysis, stratify the subgroups of interest, and then you report the respective costs and health outcomes for each stratified group, whatever that group might be, alongside the headline cost effectiveness summaries for the full population. Now, the more advanced method of this is the weighting approach, which is basically the same as the impact approach, but you have quality impact weightings by subgroup. And this is the basis of something which you might have heard of called distributional cost effectiveness analysis. DCEA basically allows a distribution of weights, so society's inequality aversion can be directly compared against total population quality gains willing to forego to reduce, minimize inequality. So it allows for this trading off between cost effectiveness and inequality. But Laura will discuss more about equity considerations later. So in summary, despite the 7 challenges outlined, there are actually methods and work ongoing to tackle each of these challenges, but it is often actually done at a national rather than a local level. So we do need to start thinking about the local level, given the budgets and commission that sits there. Across the 7 challenges, in terms of cost effectiveness thresholds, there's been work to do evidence-based cost effectiveness threshold estimations, but these have not been formally adopted. For example, NICE still uses £20,000 to £30,000 per quality, not that £13,000 per quality which Claxton calculated. I think it's even lower than that now. In terms of budgets, we do need to start thinking about accounting for affordability alongside the use of ISAs and CETs. In terms of future value, exploration of alternative discount rates would be useful. In terms of costs, we really need to start thinking about investing in metadata and administrative care record systems so we can get this routine data, which will then inform the analysis, which Chris will talk about later. There's been outcomes, so developing outcomes which actually work across sectors, so capture health and public health and other wellbeing aspects, such as the AQ health wellbeing measure, which Clara will talk about later. And in terms of sectors, there's simple ways of presenting results in a disaggregated fashion, and we can learn from methods associated with CCA, MCDA, and extended impact inventory. In terms of subgroups, there needs to be further development and use of DCEA in particular. This is really interesting method which we should look at. So there's a whole range of challenges and opportunities relevant for all areas of research and commissioning, but particularly commissioning of cross-sector health and non-health and longer-term care solutions are particularly pertinent to ageing, mental health and frail populations. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt. That's really, really helpful. I mean, I think that's where a lot of researchers struggle, actually, that sort of making that, well, bridging that gap between research, trial-based research and local commissioning decisions, and setting out those 7 challenges is a really helpful way to understand it better. We've probably got time for one quick question, actually. If I can find it. Oh yeah, here we go. So yeah, it's from Lisa Cummins. So asking specifically about using socio-technical allocation of resources to inform decisions at ICS level, e.g. across a pathway for a given condition. Well, any brief thoughts on that, Matt?
I know a lot of methods and a lot of approaches. I do not know Star.
Okay. Well, if anyone else in the panel does, then that might be something they could pick up. Laura, go on, Laura. Yeah.
I think it's equivalent to program budgeting and margin analysis. Matt, is my understanding. If that helps.
Oh, Matt Sutton's put a link in, actually.
Well, if it's similar to program budgeting and marginal analysis, it's been kicking around in CCGs and LAs for a while, and they did used to teach people on it. My recent conversations, because we've been talking about PBMA quite a lot, is actually it's not used and it's a bit outdated, and the consideration that you can actually at any given time point really know what your budget is a problem with that approach. We've been looking at it, but if ICS has restarted or at least renamed it, it would have to have changed a little bit for it to be used, because my conversations is that PBMA isn't being used, but there are principles alongside it, like really focusing on what your actual budget is, which does have an advantage. So
thanks, Matt.